CTNS J.K. Russell Fellowship Research Conference. I'm Bob Russell, the Director of CTNS and Professor of Theology and Science here at the GTU, and it's a pleasure to welcome you again and to see you here engaging for a day-long conversation about a critically important issue both for theology and for society: the relation between Christian faith and evolutionary biology. As I said last night, so I'll say just briefly again, the research program is part of the CTNS mission to promote the creative, mutual discussion between theology and science, or interaction even. And it stands apart from voices of conflict, which say science and religion are necessarily in conflict, that science is intrinsically atheistic, or that religion is merely about values, not about facts. And it stands apart from voices that say that we really should simply keep them separate and ignore any kind of possible interaction. So it isn't a conflict model, it isn't a separation model, it's a model of genuine interaction, one in which both sides are respected, both sides are valued. It's not a turf war, but instead it's a commitment to growing within one's own position and tradition in light of the conversations with the other. It's a position that respects the other and hopes to find value added for both sides of the conversation. So like any good partnership, we stay the same as we change, and we change to stay who we are. It's a pleasure again to introduce my colleagues and friends, Marty Hewlett, virologist, and Ted Peters, Lutheran theologian, who are this year's joint fellows. You have their CVs in the brochure. I won't take time to read them, but they both have, as you know, distinguished careers, and particularly distinguished in their partnership and ongoing relationship, which models this kind of mutual creative interaction. Because Ted becomes an even more impressive and compelling theologian as he engages with evolutionary biology, in my view. And in my view, Marty becomes an even more important spokesperson for the importance, the cultural significance of evolutionary biology beyond the specialization of the lab for contemporary society as he engages in conversations with the humanities, and in particular with philosophical, systematic theology and moral inquiry. So it's a wonderful example of changing and staying the same in that combination, a true partnership. And their fellowship evidences and exemplifies what I think is one of the great goals of CTNS. So it's a delight to welcome them again here with us. We had a wonderful presentation for those here last night. They laid out this broad range of views or cases, all of which come under the generic sort of referential term of theistic evolution. And we'll discuss that term today, thanks to Antje's paper and many others. They discussed how it stands aside from ID and creationism, and stands aside from atheism and agnosticism and deism, and opts for a very aggressive view of God's action in the world, in particular through evolution. And then it raises some profound questions. Today we'll see that that spectrum that they presented last night, and is of course in their writings, is exemplified through a variety of papers. Now there are many more positions that aren't here explicitly in those papers, and it would be wonderful to have several days for a conference, and I apologize for the views that haven't been invited to be explicitly here in papers, but I'm hoping that through the discussants and through all of us, those other views will come in, because there really is a diversity of colors in the rainbow that represents this broad view. So the format for today is pretty simple. We have 6 papers, we have about 24 discussants, and a wonderful audience. We're going to give about 45 minutes per paper, and that will include roughly up to 15 minutes for the author of the paper to present their views, summarize, be self-critical, maybe say things they left out or want to have thought of since they want to include. And then we'll have a half an hour of moderated discussion. And that'll be amongst the discussants and the authors. And there will be 2 sessions, as you see, general discussion at 11:45 and also at 4:30 for the wider audience to be part of this conversation as well. If you want to see copies of the paper, they're in the corner on the table. You can have them, and we're hoping that these papers will go through the referee process and will be in the distinguished journal Theology and Science down the road. So you'll get copies there. So we're going to start with a few minutes for Marty and Ted to summarize their views and to start us off, and then I'll moderate the first discussion, which will continue on up to lunch. So let's welcome Ted and Marty.
May I remind everyone to either turn off your cell phones or put them on silent? Thank you.
One of the characteristics of CTNS that I have most appreciated over the last 2.5 decades is the team approach to moving the frontier of scholarship forward, and we plan on doing that today. In the past, the J.K. Russell Fellow has usually been an individual that we invite here to start a fire, and then we ask other competent scholars to dump water on it. And the result is usually smoke and fog, and it's kind of difficult to see your way. Well, this time around, Marty and I have started a little fire, but we've asked a number of you to light your fires as well. And we're hoping that this group of fires will provide some illumination finally. And there's a reason why we want to do this. One of the things that has bothered us at CTNS in general, and Marty and myself in particular, as we mentioned last evening, is that it appears that the agenda to discuss the theological significance of evolution has been usurped and it has been dictated by, on the one hand, intelligent design most recently, but in a sustained way really over the last couple of decades on the other side by the materialist position. And it's been a bit frustrating, especially over the last half decade or so, to constantly have to be responding to the questions that are posed by intelligent design. And Rudolf Bultmann, back in the days of hermeneutics, said, the Fragestellung, or the way you pose a question, really sets the parameters of the discussion. And part of the frustration is that the questions intelligent design asks are not our questions. And to constantly have to stay within those parameters has been frustrating. So one of the objectives here last night and today is to try and pose the questions that we believe are the key ones and the important ones for dealing with this very complex interaction between evolutionary biology and a theological understanding of reality. So the task, as Marty and I conceived of it yesterday, was to make our case for a theistic evolution and asking others to make their case for movement in the direction of a theistic evolution, not to finalize an ideology, a new ideology, but just to recognize that there's a large number of people in our society, and especially in the scholarly community, for whom this is a very important agenda. But it's not yet coherently articulated in such a way that it is easily understood. Now, we think there are two reasons why there's some urgency for scholars to engage in this. First of all, just for the sake of intellectual clarity and self-understanding. It's a topic worth pursuing, and even if nobody outside this room ever knew what we were doing, at least we would enjoy it. It's intellectually satisfying. But there's also a more practical cultural need at this point. And one of the ways that we get into it is Marty's experience as a professor teaching young people coming into biology classes in the university who are afraid to study science. Why? Because they've heard in their congregations that science is of the devil, it's going to ruin their faith, and usually if you ask about it, it's the evolution controversy that they heard about that is turning them off. We think that Christians at their best and Jews and Muslims at their best have honor and respect for science at its best. And somehow or other, we need to address or reformulate the questions in such a way that that part of the expression of our faith can come through. And young people need to hear in their religious communities that science is a possible vocation for them. And so one of the possible byproducts of the kind of discussion that we're going to have today is that we might be able to rise to a level of articulation in which there can be a positive affirmation of both faith and science that could provide some spiritual guidance, intellectual guidance for young people as they look forward to their own futures. So that might be a cultural byproduct, even though that's not our task today. Our task today is going to be the more basic intellectual one. Marty, your 2 cents worth?
2 cents and some change. I agree with Ted that a large part of this discussion has been defined, especially in the popular press, by the extremes. As Ted said, one of those extremes has been more or less the theological, societal extreme of things like scientific creationism and intelligent design. But the other side is interesting to consider too. That is what Ted called the ontological materialist side, or the atheistic materialist side. Let's just reflect back for a minute on what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a science, the science of biology, and we're dealing with a model, that is an explanation, an explanatory model for a set of observations. How did all of this wonderful set of life forms that we experience on this planet come to be by some set of natural causes? What would explain that? When Darwin presented that model in the 19th century, there was a debate among scientists about whether it was an adequate model. For instance, Darwin did not have an adequate explanation for heredity. Mendel's work, which was taking place at the same time Darwin's book was being published in that decade, Mendel's work was published in 1868, and no one read it, as you all know, and it didn't get rediscovered for some 50 years. So in Darwin's mind, the kind of heredity he envisioned was what most people in the 19th century science community thought of, and that was blending inheritance. And an engineer in London pointed out, after reading Darwin's paper, that this whole idea of descent with modification was ridiculous because, after all, any inherited characteristics would soon be blended out in the population. How could they be selected for? So there were debates going on within the science itself about whether this was, in fact, an acceptable model. It wasn't until the 20th century and that great synthesis that Julian Huxley talked about, that the real kind of selection that was taking place began to take hold in some paradigmatic form for our science. And so with the advent of a real appreciation of genetics, the Mendelian laws, an understanding of mutations, an understanding of DNA, we got finally a theory which seemed to be scientifically coherent. One on which we could model observations, and one which, as I tried to demonstrate last night, is fruitful even today for us, even in fields ranging from virology to human biology. Now, the problem is, as I see it, that during that time when the science was maturing, some aspects of the science, and now let me say some aspects of the scientists engaging in it, got captured by those overlays that we talked about last night. The overlay that Huxley put on it the day after the book came out. So we saw Thomas Huxley wrote this letter the next day saying, your book now justifies everything I want to say. And so the agenda that we see being set today is not really being set as much by the science, which is still an ongoing study of models of observation, one that, by the way, is still being debated. I mean, we have discussions as to whether it's adaptation or exaptation. We have discussions about the nature of gradualism and how important gradual change is as opposed to larger kinds of changes like symbiotic relationships. We still are waiting to see the impact of network systems biology on the entire field of evolution. So there's still a lot of motion going on within this paradigm, but that's not what's setting the limits of this debate. As Ted said, the limits are being set and the topics are being set by this reaction to Darwin's model that took place more among the social sciences in England than it was among the physical or biological sciences. And those scientists today who've been captured by that ideology, people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and others, are the ones that have wound up setting the other side of the limit. And I know that today we're going to address mostly the theological issues, mostly the philosophical issues, but I want to make a plea that we also consider the other side of this debate and the questions that are being mounted by people on that particular side, especially the non-scientific questions. So as we begin our deliberations, I would ask that we keep all of that in mind and move to, as Ted said, hopefully some new ground in this discussion, some new limits that we choose to set for what are the important questions as we deal with the really seminal issue of biological evolution and what it means to be human in this world. Okay, Bob.
Good. For the first time today, and perhaps the last time, we're ahead of schedule. So let's see if we can stay that way. Our first of the 6 papers is by Ian Barber. And again, we'll have 15 minutes, and then we'll have half an hour for discussion. Ian?
Well, I greatly appreciated Ted and Marty's paper. There's a great deal in it with which I agree. I liked his portrayal of ID and his portrayal of science and his conclusion that ID is not science. I think that was beautifully presented. I agree with him that we should seek a theology of what I've called a theology of nature, starting from a theological tradition and working towards science, rather than a natural theology that starts with science and works towards theological conclusions. I agree with their way they treated what they call the overlays, ideological overlays. I would call them metaphysical interpretations or extrapolations. But I think that was a very helpful kind of thing. I'm less happy with their reliance on the primary versus secondary causality scheme as a way of relating the fields. It's a very useful and powerful and excellent way of replying to the ID people who confuse the two, and therefore the first thing you need to do is to separate the two. And I think they have as a way of replying to ID, you avoid conflict, because if they're in separate compartments, they can't conflict. But neither can they very constructively interact. And as I read the way they use the scheme, it doesn't move very far beyond the independence or separation scheme. Primary causality would be compatible with almost any kind of operation going on in the secondary causality scheme. That would simply be the way of God operates however it is. So that it seems to me it limits the possibility, it avoids conflicts, which is great, and maybe that's what we need to do first after what happened in Pennsylvania and so forth. But it doesn't immediately open the door towards any very creative interaction. And I think it's evident to me in the way that they end up staying pretty much with classical neo-Darwinism and staying pretty much with classical Christianity. They have some interest, and Marty's other writings have a lot of interest in alternatives to neo-Darwinism. He was talking about systems theories, for example. And I would like to see a greater degree of integration and a greater degree of openness to change on both sides. They treat them sort of as two givens, and they keep on referring to relating neo-Darwinism in the way that the majority of biologists certainly think. But I would be more open to other possibilities. So I want to make a few comments about ID. If we can have the lights down a bit, and if we can have the screen is a little bit darker. Can these be a little bit darker without hurting the cameraman too much? But the cameraman can get the slides at a later point. The copies of the paper, incidentally, are on the back table, and anybody that wants to get a copy, much of this material is in that paper. This issue of Time last summer, when the Dover trial was going on, was on their slideshow too. Let me just see how we're working here. Yeah, that's fine. Bush, of course, you know that Bush endorsed. Last summer, Bush said he thought the school should teach both sides of the controversy so students could make up their own minds. That was his way of bowing to the ID people, though he didn't exactly endorse it. He wanted to see it taught as an alternative so students could then make up their mind. There can be humor on both sides. The ACLU was the group that were the councils for the Dover School Board initially, and so you can have cartoons on both sides to show that one can be at least partially independent. The proponents of ID differ from both biblical literalism and creation science, which were the subjects of previous court rulings. I think one needs to make that distinction, that this is not just creation science, though it has much in common with it, but it escapes the previous court rulings against creation science. It makes no reference to the Bible, and the proponents accept a long history of life on Earth. But they insist that some organic structures are so complex that they could not have evolved by gradual stages. Systematic coordination of many parts, for example of the eye, must be the product of supernatural intervention by an intelligent designer. The overwhelming majority of biologists reject these claims, and that's clear from the Marty and Ted paper. The human eye, for example, could have evolved by gradual steps from simpler visual systems like those in some other species today. ID does not lead to hypotheses that can be tested and experimentally tested, which is a key feature of science. ID does not lead to research papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and this cannot be attributed simply to the biases of the dominant scientific elite that controls journals, which is the ID answer as to why there aren't more papers in the journal. And there's some truth to the fact that the people that control the journals have their own biases, but I think it's pretty clear that they simply haven't even submitted the papers. ID proponents rightly object that some biologists, such as Dawkins, defend atheism, naturalism, or materialism as if they were scientifically proven claims, and they would join the kinds of critique of the naturalistic interpretations that you found in the Peters and Marty paper. These are indeed philosophical interpretations brought to the data rather than experimentally testable hypotheses. But ID is subject to the same criticism, even though its belief system is very different. We can accept methodological naturalism, which says that science is limited to studying natural causes, without accepting philosophical naturalism, which says that nature is all there is, and science is the only path to understanding, what's sometimes called scientism. Explanatory pluralism suggests that there are a variety of types of explanation answering differing types of questions in human life. Now, they have said, the ID people say evolution is a theory and not a fact. And let me say, all these 4 points I'm going to make are in the Marty and Ted paper, but they simply treat evolution in general and make these points in relation to evolutionary theory. And I suggest that you need to break down evolution theory into several stages that one would look at a little bit differently. and to sort of separate out these components. Evidence for a long history of descent with modification from earlier forms is so overwhelming that it should be considered even a fact. Considered a fact even though the past cannot be observed directly. I mean, you can say gravitation is just a theory. You can't observe it. But it's a theory you better take seriously if you're going to jump out of a tall building, for example. So that there are degrees of claims made in evolution. And I think the history of descent is so overwhelmingly supported. Secondly, the theory that natural selection plays a central evolutionary role is very strongly supported by independent evidence from many disciplines, including paleontology, physiology, genetics, embryology, molecular biology, and immunology. It occurs today in the evolution of antibiotic-resistant pathogens, and we fear it may occur in new forms of bird flu, as they pointed out. Evolutionary theory is impressive because it is able to integrate such a wide range of disciplines across many fields of both biological and physical science, so that it's partly its scope that is so impressive. Thirdly, there are indeed debates among biologists about the role of other factors, such as historical contingencies, social structures, or developmental constraints on possible embryonic forms. But these debates yield hypotheses that can be tested before they are accepted as theories. He made that point just now about some of these new things, and I would give a more central emphasis to them. Fourthly, no theory can be verified with certainty, but a theory can be falsified or its domain can be limited by an accumulation of data that conflicts with it. This is kind of the Popper point about falsification. More rarely, a theory can be replaced in a paradigm shift, as Kuhn said, based on alternative presuppositions. For example, Newtonian mechanics replaced by quantum theory for very small structures and by relativity for rapidly moving ones. So often it's restricting the domain of a theory that allows you to deal with apparent conflicts with it. But those have to be supported, and the ID people sometimes say, well, we're advocating a new paradigm shift, but that can't be an excuse for just saying, well, anything goes. The paradigm shift has to be supported, even if it can't be directly verified. So where does the support for ID movement come from if it's really not that strong among scientists? Well, I suggest that local support has come primarily from evangelical Christians whose motivations are clearly religious rather than scientific, and the judge said that too. Financial support has come mainly from the religious right through the Discovery Institute in Seattle, with which most of the witnesses supporting ID at recent trials and hearings have been affiliated. ID is seen as an opening wedge for the inclusion of Christian beliefs in public education. I think this kind of a social context is important, and it's implied in some of their, and they didn't have room to cover everything in their papers, but it seems to me one needs to look at the social context of the ID movement, and particularly the social context of fundamentalism, which is a little bit wider. Secularism, religious pluralism, and alternative lifestyles and gender roles are seen as threats to traditional family values. That's much of what drives the fundamentalist conviction. There is a search for security in a changing world. The absolutism of truth claims and of moral values that they present in response to what they see as an all-encompassing relativism is the only alternative, and no middle ground between absolutism and relativism. So if you give up the one, they think you end up totally with the other. So the search for a middle ground in ethics is another kind of aspect. I think they rightly stress the power of emotion in religious life, which has been lost in the formality and intellectualism of mainline churches. So much of what drives fundamentalism, I think one needs to take seriously, but not by means of adoption. Are there parallels to Islam in terms of, I think one needs to say that Islam takes very diverse forms from Morocco to Indonesia, Arab and non-Arab, Sunni and Shiite, intellectual and popular, in developing nations or technologically advanced countries. So one's got to be very wary of generalizing about Islam. And I think one probably shouldn't use the term Islamic fundamentalism because the Quran differs a bit, though not that much perhaps, from its role in the Bible. Many Muslim scholars reject evolutionary theory as a product of materialism, secularism, and what they call Western science, which accompanied colonialism when they came to the Arab world, and has been perpetuated by military occupation. So there's still, among the more radical members at least, an identification of evolution with Western science, with Western imperialism. So that history is hard to overcome. The Western pattern of modernization seems to conflict with the political goals of nationalism and independence. Despite such differences in historical and political context, both Christian and Islamic conservatives have seen secularism as a threat to traditional values, and they're willing to use the power of the state to enforce strict and unchanging rules of morality for all citizens. So I do see a parallel, particularly in the willingness to use the power of the state to enforce one particular view of morality. So that I would be wary. I'm not an Islamic expert, and some of you may want to qualify this even more than I do. But I think with some qualifications, one can see this problem as not just a Western one. And of course, Ted in particular has been very much in dialogue with Islamic scholars, which I greatly respect. There are also local school board issues, which if we're going to try to address the school board kinds of things, are important too. Local control of school boards. Parents should decide what they want to have their children taught. Federal courts are out of touch with local sentiments. Those are the kind of things you hear. The reply should be that the promulgation of particular religious belief violates the constitutional separation of church and state, that science teachers have no time to do primary research or reading and must draw from the wider community of scientists and accept their standards, though not necessarily their philosophies. The science teacher simply can't be a researcher or really an expert on the latest trends in science. The National Academy of Sciences in 1988 said, "Science is limited to explaining the natural world through natural causes. Science can say nothing about the supernatural. Whether God exists or not is a question about which science is neutral." So the NAS took this two worlds separation, independence view to avoid the conflict, and it's very useful in that context, and I think that's the point one probably needs to start, though I hope one doesn't end there myself. The media coverage, which was just mentioned, I think, this morning very nicely, the media has presented the two extremes, people who believe in God but not evolution, people who believe in evolution but not God, as if conflict were inevitable, and one had to choose between them. They've tended to leave out those, that's what he calls the theistic evolutionists, who affirm both God and evolution, or who hold that evolution is God's way of creating. So I want to look at some recent ideas in evolutionary theory, and then lastly at alternative ways of relating science and religion. The challenge of evolution is threefold, and the first is the challenge to biblical literalism. That doesn't apply so much to ID, but it does apply to the majority of ID supporters. Many theologians since St. Augustine have interpreted scriptural passages metaphorically rather than literally. Since the 19th century, historical scholars have said that the Bible expressed enduring theological insights in terms of the pre-scientific cosmology of the Middle East. Fundamentalism and creation science are more recent views, mainly in the U.S. So one could spend a whole conference or a whole day on the problem of biblical literalism, which I think lies behind the power of the religious right, even though ID people are not themselves religious literalists. The second major issue has been to human uniqueness, and I think this is much of what drives the controversy from the creationist side, the threat to human nature. And there the reply, I would have to say, is that humans are descendants of non-human ancestors and share many characteristics with them, but they have distinctive capacities such as symbolic thought and language and forms of culture. You may have seen the retrospective treatment on the Scopes trial that was on National Public Television last fall, and they repeatedly play this jingle that was played, "You're not going to make a monkey out of me," so that the threat to human dignity is certainly part of it. But that's not where the focus of this conference is. Rather, the focus of this conference is on design. Okay. Alternative views of design of laws only in in Darwin, design of initial conditions in Hawking, control of quantum uncertainties in Russell, and evolutionary convergence in Morris, and emergent levels in Kaufman. Darwin says, I'm inclined to look at everything resulting from designed laws with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working of what we may call chance. I cannot think that the world is as we see it, is the result of chance, yet I cannot look at separate things as the result of design. Your recent moderator has suggested that God determines quantum events. This is one alternative way of looking at it, not intervention to alter an existing state, but actualizing one of the range of potentialities present. You'll give his paper later today. God could make the final determination among states of identical energy, but no energy input is needed. It's scientifically undetectable if statistically lawful. Small differences at the quantum level are sometimes amplified to give large-scale effects in chaos theory, in mutations, perhaps in neural systems. God might determine all events, or only some. The problem there is if God determines all events, it's difficult to reconcile divine sovereignty with suffering, evil, and human freedom, even if God's control is subtle and does not violate scientific laws. So he can talk about non-interventionist views. The alternative, I think, is to see both chance and law as part of the design of nature. And among the people that do this, but with only a relatively small role for chance, is Simon Conway Morris. In his book, came out 3 years ago, Life Solutions, says that very different lineages converge on similar solutions. Camera-like eyes evolved independently. Many physiological and behavioral parallels between marsupial and placental mammals. Similarities in brain structure, communication, and social structure in dolphins and chimps. Chance is less significant in the outcome when there are only a limited number of effective solutions. So he says the constraints of evolution and the ubiquity of convergence make the emergence of something like ourselves a near inevitability. And one would need here to also look at this new movement that's called Evo-Devo, or we say Evo-Devo, but Evo-Devo is the way they say it in England, in which the importance of the developmental regulatory gene structures, so that whole groups of organs develop together, and the way that in the embryological development, these are coordinated at a higher level than of the individual genes for characteristics, so that the role of developmental biology has just come to the fore, I think, in the last few years. Stuart Kaufman, I think I'll do this rather rapidly. This is his view that it's at the border between chaos and stability that complexity can arise. You have a stable system at the left there, like a crystal with not very much complexity, and at the right you have a chaotic system. You could imagine a gas, so it's primarily at higher levels, and it's in between, if you want, the things that develop in liquids, for example, with intermediate range of disorder, or if you want, intermediate range of order, that complex systems can evolve, and particularly that out of elements, by self-organization, they can emerge systems which then feed back to dominate over the elements. And I've written a bit about this idea of emergent hierarchy of levels, epistemological reductionism, ontological reductionism as the alternative, and I would tend to go with emergence, which is that the novel forms of order at higher levels are unpredictable from theories and laws governing lower levels. That's the epistemological form. The ontological form is top-down causality, that systems at higher levels influence the boundary conditions of systems at lower levels without violating lower-level laws. So this is what Bob would call a non-interventionist scheme, but it does not rely on the bottom-up things from the quantum level up to higher levels, but sees this going on as at all levels, as he allows may be true in his more recent writing. Are the trends in evolutionary history? Well, there's no simple directionality. There's opportunism, blind alleys. The overall trends, however, are toward greater diversity, responsiveness, and complexity. which I take to be the number of significant connections and levels of organization. And there is an increase in the capacity to gather, store, and process information as you move through this series of levels, so that I think one can talk about trends, even though it's not a simple directionality. That, of course, we could debate for a while. And I think the question of causality, biologists have objected when formal or final causes are substituted for the search of efficient causes, but I don't think that rules them out. The primary and secondary causality scheme, which we heard about a little bit yesterday in Neo-Thomism, that God works through secondary cause, and the primary cause is a totally different order of explanation, answering questions unlike those that science asks about relationships between natural events. So it does end up close to a two-language view. God is radically transcendent, not another cause like natural causes. The integrity of the created order and the integrity of science are preserved, as Bill Steger, who is among us from the Vatican Observatory and JSTB. And another exponent is is Howard Van Til, the Calvin physicist, that nature is a developmental economy. God is a communicator of information with an ordered pattern in a sequence of elements. The communication of information when one system responds selectively to another, and the responding system may be a cell or a computer or a human person. But the important thing is that the meaning of the message is not contained in the sequence itself, but is dependent on the wider context of interpretation. This is the view that John Polkinghorne has developed, and he ties it in with the idea of the divine word, the logos, as a kind of information. The meaning of message is discernible only in the context of interpretation. God is top-down cause in Peacock, who's been previous, well, almost all these people have been previous JFK speakers. Haven't they all been? I think so. Peacock extends the idea of top-down causality. It says that upper levels produce constraints or boundary conditions on lower levels without violating lower-level laws, and he talks about open-ended design that expresses both chance and law. He's done more with chance than almost any other writings. So God's purposes are communicated through patterns of events, not a predetermined plan. Christ is the mode of God's self-expression. God's self-limitation has been another recent theme. I see Nancy Murphy has joined us, and her co-author, George Ellis, who was also here a couple of years ago as a Russell Fellow. This works a path between the omnipotent God of classical Christianity and the inactive God of deism. God's power is not omnipotent control, but the empowerment of other beings. It's an incomplete cosmos still coming into being. As Teilhard said, it's the cross that shows a God who participates in suffering and transforms it through redeeming love. I think there are parallels between the feminist critique of male images of coercive power in human relations, man over woman, or God's action, again, the image of coercive power as a rather male image of power in both of these contexts. Process theology is where I come out, in which reality is a dynamic web of momentary events. This rejects both mind-matter dualism and materialism. All integrated entities have objective and subjective or experiential features, but only higher levels are conscious. To every entity, God presents new possibilities with opening alternatives. God is the ultimate source of both order and novelty. Jack Haught, has he been a... Yes. He's been a fellow. Oh, wow, we've got almost all the JFK fellows here. An unfinished universe shows order and disorder, and that's compatible with the biblical message of promise and hope, but not with the idea of completed design. A God of self-limiting love allows creaturely creativity in the emergency of new forms of order, relationality, and inclusive community. He also develops the theme of empowerment versus power over. God's participation in the suffering of the world contrasts with God's detachment in deism. Promise and hope point toward the future. Another strong theme in Ted and Marty, rather than the past. Now, I want to just propose in closing, where they see the second person of the Trinity as the fruitful opening for the dialogue. One neglected in favor of the first person in so many of the science and theology discussions. I see the third person as the most important, of a new way to look in, if you want Trinitarian terms, at the dialogue. The Spirit is neuter rather than the other two are male. The Spirit opens doors to communicating with other religious traditions, whereas the exclusivity of the second person incarnate in Christ is very important in our internal dialogue, but does not open the same kind of doors to communication. Resurrection is certainly a terribly important theme in Christian thought, but if we're going to put all our chips on the resurrection as the way to the dialogue, it does not open very many, for me at least, does not open very many doors to discussions with other religious communities. It represents God active in nature and human life. The earth was without form and void. The Spirit of God at the first of Genesis, there's the Spirit. Plants and animals, when thou sendest forth thy Spirit, they are created, says the psalmist after discussing animal and plant life. It's the inspiration of the prophet, the same root as Spirit. It's in worship, take forth thy Holy Spirit. Christ received the Spirit at baptism. So it gives the Spirit a very important role in Christology, as well, of course, as in nature, and of course in the foundation of the church. The follower is empowered by the Spirit. So the role of the Spirit in nature, in religious experience, and in the life of Christ offers a common framework for creation and redemption, which are often contrasted. And I agree with their thesis that we need to talk about both creation and redemption. But it seems to me one can do that more fruitfully in the framework of talking about the Spirit. So I will leave you to see from the last page of the written version the four things that I have to say about their stress on eschatology. The first is that our claims have to be very tentative and speculative because we really can't say very much about it. And in particular, it seems to me there's a kind of literalism in their way they treat some of the, well, not literalism, but they stress the images in the book of Revelation really more than the images in Genesis. In fact, they say God couldn't really have meant it when he said about the whole creation, it was very good. I mean, he says, obviously it isn't very good. I mean, it seems to me that I'm interested in putting, and the lion lying down with the lamb, they suggest that it tells us the laws of nature will be changed to make such states possible. It seems to me that's a difficult thing to communicate to scientists. Anyway, then that redemption occurs within history. They say that too, but I want to do that a little more strongly. And in particular, the process theologians who see God as present in the ordering of possibilities in every event, so it isn't intervention discontinuously. God is already present, so he doesn't have to intervene. And then lastly, that if the future is really open, it cannot act on the present. And though they don't quite say that, it seems to me they're talking about it's coming out of the future as if the future was already there. God creates from the future retroactively. Now, maybe the view of eternity that they take allows that, but it seems to me that tends to reify the future. And so I end by saying, I think if the future really is open, we have to avoid reifying it or imagining it to exist even in God's mind. So I'm grateful for this thought-provoking paper, even if I raise some questions about the reliance on eschatology. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. We have a half an hour for conversation. I'm going to take questions in the following way. If you have a a new topic to raise, raise your hand. If you want to comment on the topic being discussed, just indicate with a finger, and I'll sort of take 2 or 3 at a time and then allow Ian or Ted and Marty to respond as appropriate. But first, let's let Ted or Marty make a comment on Ian's paper as they wish. And I'll be sitting here, so let's be certain to catch my eye.
To be judicious, Bob, both Marty and I have something to say, but how much time should we, 5 minutes each, something like that? As usual, Ian has given us a whole encyclopedia of very fascinating things. I'm just going to pick on one item to offer as a comment, and that's the description of fundamentalists as insecure. I think to refer to fundamentalists as insecure is a myth that liberals tell themselves so that their enemies appear to be weak. One of the things that we engaged in our research was to try to get to know the creationists as they understand themselves. And I cannot imagine Dwayne Gish saying, "Hi, I'm a fundamentalist, I'm insecure, and I don't like change." This is not the way they understand themselves.
I didn't use the word insecure, I said threatened.
Threatened. But I just want to disagree with that, because all of us live in a world of change, and the fundamentalists, just like the rest of us, select those things that are changing that they can accept and those things that they cannot. Fundamentalists and creationists are very happy with changes in technology. They have some of the most advanced websites, etc. You're right in saying that they don't like what's happening to the family. They don't like what they perceive to be as the moral breakdown of society. And so they select certain issues that they're very concerned about. But you know, almost every political segment is concerned about one or another issue. And I just want to say, I think Marty and I have come to respect the creationists more, I think, than their opponents do. One of the things that gets forgotten is that the moral objection to evolution in our society has a history to it. And we can trivialize it by saying, oh, they don't like gays, and they don't like feminists, and they don't. We can trivialize it. But if you take a look at the history, this is a rather serious matter, and it connects with the common descent issue as to whether or not we have descended along with the great apes from a common ancestor. At the end of the 19th century, when the bush or the tree was drawn, the various races, human races, were drawn as having descended from various forms of the great apes, and these were ranked so that some monkeys were thought to be higher on the evolutionary tree than others, and some races were higher, and black people were down on the bottom. They were the closest to the apes, and hence the most violent. And as you went up, the most superior of all were the English white people. Funny thing. And so the creationists have seen how evolutionary science has justified racism. And so they counter this by affirming that there is only one mother and father of us all, that's Adam and Eve, and every human being, regardless of race, is a child of this one human family. And so they have moral reasons for denying common descent with monkeys simply because of the history of evolutionary science and its contribution to racism over the years. They're not the only ones that deny common descent. Actually, Roman Catholic theologians, Pope John Paul II, Benedict XVI, have their own variant of creationism. And even though they could accept biological common descent with other forms of life, They want to hold out for the doctrine that God creates the soul and imparts it to the biological organism, and it's the soul that gives us personhood, and it's the soul that becomes the ground of dignity. And there is some continuity between that and the position of the creationists and the fundamentalists. A close look at William Jennings Bryan, for example, who is disparaged in the movie Inherit the Wind for being a bigot, was not a bigot. He actually said that he could accept evolutionary theory, but his problem was, what about the uniqueness of the human being? Because he wanted the human being to have dignity, to separate it from what the animal world, which had been used by the German military machine to justify its own aggression during the First World War. And so he was battling between the morality or the moral implications of Darwinism on the one hand and the science on the other. And he finally said the following. He said, you know, I believe that God created human beings specially, but if the scientists prove that we descended from monkeys, then I will believe it. So I think there's a good deal more subtlety going on in here than to say, well, the fundamentalists, the people on the right, are just threatened and insecure about changes and they can't really adapt and they go and they hide in absolutes. I just want to say, I don't think that describes the people that we're actually having to deal with.
I just want to take a couple of quick minutes and then let us get on, Bob, to some questions from everyone else. But first of all, Ian, thank you very much for your paper. And I really appreciated the depth of criticism that you went to for us. It's going to help us tremendously in our research. I want to just make a quick comment about the primary-secondary causation issue that you raised. And as you rightfully said, we used that more to address the ID issue than we did in pushing the research further. And as you pointed out, you could conclude from the way we wrote this and what we've done so far that we were opting for this contrast model. That, in other words, primary causation keeps us separate from secondary causes and sort of makes a two-language issue out of it. But I just want to point out that in Thomas's writings, God's action is seen not only as creation at the beginning, ex nihilo, but also continuing creation. And what Thomas writes about is that the act of continuing creation for God is both the act of differentiation and also embellishment. And those are exactly the kinds of things we see happening in the unfolding of the natural world, especially the natural living world. So it occurs to me that in some sense, part of our task for the future is to try to understand how the secondary causes are directly related to these primary cause actions of God, especially the continuing creative acts that support the natural world in complexification. And it's going to be papers like Bob's this afternoon that start to address the kinds of mechanisms that might be present in natural causes that we can hopefully begin to tie to primary cause in some sense. It's not that we're going to prove primary causation at all, but at least begin to tie them together in a way that might overcome this blockage that Ian pointed out that appears to be inherent in what we wrote. The only other comment I want to make is just a little story. The history of fundamentalism, as Ted has pointed out, is rife with these reasons for people wanting to react against the evolutionary model. But I just want you to look at it from the standpoint of a scientist for a minute. I was a chemist originally, and it had nothing really to do with biology as a young student. And I saw my life as a scientist being something like the following. I'd get my degree in chemistry, and off I would go into a room full of scientists, and we'd close the door, and the public would sort of slide money under the door, and out of the top in the transom would come all these wonderful advances, and I'd have this great life in the ivory tower. And long about the 1980s, somebody knocked on the door and said, what's going on in there? And unfortunately, we let the wrong person answer the door, because the person who answered the door said, well, what we've done in here is we've discovered that the universe is purposeless and there's no God. And the door closed. Well, the people outside said, wait a minute, that's not what we've been giving you money to do. So since then, my life has changed. And we just picked the wrong guy to answer the door. I think if we had picked someone else, we might be in a different place right now. So from that standpoint, I think that explains for me a lot of why we see in that survey of Eugenie Scott's that only 40% of the public in the United States is willing to agree with the statement that human beings as we know them are the result of descent with modification. They mistrust us because of that answer they got to their question. So Bob, let me turn it back to you.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes, so I see Richard.